Okay, should we go?
Sure.
I just wanted to recap a little bit. I see some new faces this afternoon, what we did this morning. This is the second part of a two-part presentation about learning disabilities and gifted kids with learning disabilities. So a good bit of the session this morning was taken up talking about learning disabilities, because you really can't speak intelligently about the gifted learning disability syndrome without learning about learning disabilities. The gifted kids with learning disabilities are not simply gifted kids who have learning disabilities. It's more complicated than that. So what we did was we talked about the nature of learning disabilities, and especially some of the basic foundational assumptions about learning disabilities, that they're intrinsic, that they're basic, that they are permanent, and that the only thing you can realistically do with learning disabilities is to compensate for them. We talked about the compensation strategies that people use for them. We talked about the tremendous controversy in the field. These are not, just want to remind people, these are not criticisms that we're leveling about the field. These are criticisms we're reporting that come from within the field about whether learning disabilities really are basic neurologic deficits, whether they only can be compensated for, whether the emotional factors are always secondary. Only if they're major emotional disorders are they considered primary issues for causing learning disabilities. And then we talked about the different methods of assessing learning disabilities, the psychoeducational assessment and the neuropsychological assessments, and talked about some of the problems with them. Then we talked about psychodynamics, and you all, there's some new people here, so when I step down and Madelon starts, I'll pass around some of these handouts. Our approach is a psychodynamic approach, and what it does is it puts context back into the assessment process and learning about learning disabilities. Most of the assessments that take place, whether they're psychoeducational or neuropsychological, it's hard to believe this, but I'm sure you've seen them and been subjected to them. They take place outside the context of a child's life. It doesn't really make sense, because all learning takes place in the context of a child's life, in their family context, their educational context. To do an assessment outside that context, and especially emotional issues that have to do with their growth and development, on a common sense basis doesn't make any sense. So we talked about where that came from, how that developed, and we talked about a concept called the cognitive revolution, another sort of astonishing trend that has taken place in which all kinds of human thinking and feeling becomes objectified so it can be measured statistically. And then we talked about the special aspects of the gifted learning disability syndrome, which Madelon's going to talk about in detail this afternoon. The standard way of looking at the gifted learning disability syndrome is a gifted child with a learning disability, and that means that you establish how a child is considered gifted, usually 130 IQ and above, and then a host of gifted traits, which you're all familiar with: intensity, special ways of thinking, moral and ethical concerns, special sensitivities, and so forth. And so the assessment of a gifted learning disabled child is usually the assessment of a learning disability. The giftedness is left off to the side, and that's exactly where the problem really is. The latest paper to be published in 2011 about the gifted learning disability syndrome is a paper that talks all about what little is known, the mystery of how these two, the learning disability and giftedness, interact with each other. Usually the way people conceive of it is giftedness can mask a learning disability, or a learning disability can mask giftedness, or they can neutralize each other. The rest is a mystery. What we're going to try to do is open up that mystery for you a little bit, so you have another way of thinking about it and another way of assessing it, and tell you a little bit about how to treat it. Just a couple of reminders. There are a couple handouts. Some of the new people back there, I'll give them to you when I step down. I know you don't have them. There is a handout that's a reading list which it's sort of a selection of various readings that we've pulled from about 200 papers that we reviewed, things that are very short and accessible. And I have selected about 5 of those papers and made copies of them. They're behind the Sing desk. It's sort of like a little resource library for you if you want while you're here. So if you're interested in this, you can go ask for a copy of, you can look at the folder and look through it and see what you are interested in and go right next door to the copy center, make a copy and return it. Because it's, a bit of a hassle to get some of these papers. They're from some obscure journals. The handout that I gave you about psychodynamics looks a little bit daunting for you, but it's not really. It's in plain English. If you want to push yourselves a little bit, I know you're all gifted, so you're not going to be happy unless you're pushed a little bit. There's another paper in the folder from the American Journal of Psychiatry called The Psychodynamic Formulation. That gives you a much more detailed, but again, it is very user-friendly. It is not to be frightened of. I think you'll find it very interesting to read. It's the only paper that I have found that my students love year after year after year. So it's tried and true. Okay, so this afternoon, we're going to try to bring to life some of what I talked about theoretically. Madelon is going to report on a case that she's treated, and she's going to hit a number of the different points that we talked about in the morning, and hopefully this will bring it to light and make it quite real for you. Okay?
Thank you, yeah. And even if you weren't here and didn't get the entire rundown of what psychodynamic therapy is like, I'm going to be stopping in the course of telling you about the different aspects of this case to highlight how the psychodynamics and the emotional component fit in. So I'm going to start with context. The first thing you do the first thing that I and we do when you get a referral is to understand the nature of the referral, why it's happening now, any of the events in a child or an adult's life that have changed that stimulate the referral. So in this case, this referral was not for learning disability, was not for difficulties in school. In fact, it was a very atypical referral in that there were no real problems. These were divorced parents who were, that light just came into my eyes. These were divorced parents who were trying to avert a problem. They had a 14-year-old son who was just about to enter high school, and because he was really smart, they weren't aware, this is a couple of years ago, and the whole concept of giftedness wasn't as popular and knowledgeable, knowable as it is now. So they didn't know he was gifted, but they knew he was very smart and always did very well in all of his courses and was well-liked and a generally well-rounded kid, but highly sensitive. And that he needed a really good high school. They didn't want to send him just to, your typical local high school because they thought he would be rather bored. And if he got bored, then he'd run into trouble. So when looking for high schools, it turned out that the father's town, which was not that far away because he had, alternate weekends and a couple of times during the week visitation rights, provided a much better environment for high school and required a pretty stiff entrance exam, which Eric actually passed very well. And so he was going to be going to school in the father's neighborhood, and that required that he move from his mother Ann's home to his father's home. And they were concerned on several levels about his upcoming year. They were concerned about his adjustment to the new home, the new town, how he was going to manage being, quote, the new kid on the block in high school, and also the academics, whether this was going to really meet his needs. So this is the background. This is the context of the referral. To have given him an IQ test alone wouldn't have told us very much about this boy. So that's for starters. Whenever you get a referral, this is me aside from the actual material that came through, whenever you get a referral, particularly with a child, but pretty much with anyone, the developmental stage that the child is in is of utmost importance, because you evaluate what you see and what the parents tell you and the child's behavior in school and all of his different environments quite differently if he's 3 or 5 or 13 or 18. So this was a boy who was 14. He was really on the cusp of puberty. And so we knew that he was, no matter what, even if he had stayed in his original environment or had been able to just move ahead in his regular school, there were going to be issues because he was facing, a new stage in life. So this is the developmental history, another very important part of the kind of information that we like to collect before actually even seeing the child. It has to do with the nature of the family, what the marriage was like. In this case, that was important because parents were divorced. What the child was like, how he had gone through some of his earlier developmental stages when they knew he was really bright, how it emerged. Now, I was at this point fairly naive myself about giftedness, and I pretty much accepted learning disabilities just as a part of what kids do, what some kids are like. But so I knew that he really didn't have any problems in the learning sphere that he had learned very well, and in fact had gone through most of his developmental stages really quite well. Slept through the night at a fairly early age, started to speak, with his first words around 6 months. Toileting was a little bit of an issue because he had his own ideas about where he was going to go to the bathroom and when he was going to, so that he was actually trained a little on the late side just before nursery school. But once he got into school, he was really thrilled. He loved learning. He loved being stimulated by the other kids. As an only child, of course, he just had his friends from the playground and neighbors. So this was a whole new group of kids for him to be friendly with. And he was really a wonderful student. And it was fairly early when he went from preschool to elementary that they discovered a couple of very important factors. They discovered, number one, that he already knew how to read, which his parents had no idea about. But as it became a formal part of his education, the teacher discovered, as is often the case, that this was a reader. In addition, he was very good at math and became much better at math as they went on. So he was really considered in the school something of a whiz. But he wasn't a geeky, nerdy kind of kid. He was popular, he was athletic, he was on sports teams. So what kind of family relationships existed, especially between Eric and his parents? Anne and Eric had always been had a very close relationship. John, the father, was at sort of the beginning of his career in finance at the time that Eric was born, so it meant that he had to be traveling around a lot, leaving Anne and Eric very much to themselves. And so they really became quite close, constant companions. She would take him to the museums and the parks and be around for him. And it was also Anne, needless to say, and frequently the case, who began to give him some reading readiness training. It was not intended in any formal way, but when he took his bath, she had letters, you've probably all seen these foam letters, to put on the side of the tub, and they would make silly sounds and start to put it into words, and he loved this. And then when he got a little bit older and really knew his letters, she would write and he would dictate stories, which they would then read to John when he came home from his trips. So reading and intellectual stimulation, as well as creativity, was very much a part of this family and this little boy's early years. Where John was concerned, he didn't see quite as much of him because he traveled, but they shared sports, and they loved tennis and would watch tennis matches, and he had one of these little mini tennis rackets that John and he played with before he was old enough to actually take on a full-size tennis racket. So this is the background. This is sort of, in figure ground sense, this is the ground against which the figure of the child and his development take place. So before I met Eric, the situation, as the parents had described it to me, seemed extremely straightforward, not terribly dramatic. Certainly it wasn't a crisis. It was before the summer, just at the end of his last semester in middle school, so he was about to have a summer off, and he was going to go into this high school, and it was a very appropriate time for the parents to contemplate having him seen by somebody and to develop a relationship that he could then fall back on if he needed it. So when I saw Eric, he was kind of cute, skinny, lanky kid, ripped jeans, and quite personable, comfortable with me. And he knew his parents were initiating his referral, and he was very tolerant of me. He said, well, I don't really need this. This is for my parents. They're kind of worried about this transition and this move, but I'm really cool. I've always made friends. I'm sure I'll make friends again in this new school. And I know John's my dad. I know him all my life. He basically poo-pooed anything that might be a problem. Well, this was the first time I met Eric, but we can see through this kind of casual and dismissive, flippant attitude of his about the potential for any kind of problem that he was engaged in what we call denial. Now, for those of you who are here this morning, denial is one of the defenses that Jerry discussed. It actually is one of the more primitive defenses. And the reason it's primitive is because there's no place for it to go. It's either on or off. Either you deny something or you accept the feelings that the denial would be covering over. And in Eric's case, it started with his being quite denying of any potential problems. He was not even willing to entertain the possibility that this was not going to be a perfect solution, unlike his parents. And this is not an unusual defense for a child of this age, because adolescents are in flux, and frequently they resort to defenses that they used at a much earlier age under the onslaught of their of hormonal development, the anxieties of being with new kids, of sexuality emerging. So I wasn't terribly disturbed by it, although I certainly took note of the fact that he was pushing this aside. However, as these things go, that didn't really last very long, because once he actually had moved officially into his dad's home, once he was anticipating within a couple of weeks the beginning of school, this denial flipped, which is what happens with denial. And all of the anxiety that had been underneath, that he had been shoving under the rug, began to emerge, and he really was quite scared and became a little obsessional. What about if these kids are really smart? What if they're snobbish? They all have their friends. How are they going to let me into their group? On and on and on. He was good in his other school. Was he going to be as good in this school? Maybe the course is really hard. Basically leaving out a lot of the reality, which was that he had passed a pretty stiff test in order to even be admitted to this school. So if he had not been so anxious, he probably could have reasoned that he had a fighting chance of doing well. But he was so overwhelmed with his anxiety that this didn't even occur to him. And so my role as therapist at this particular juncture was really to calm him down, to be very sort of practical and see why he felt that way, and did he make any friends, and just to sort of be there in the hopes that we could establish a good relationship and he could at least use me, because he was feeling a little bit torn between his two parents, who he knew didn't have such a great relationship. So in addition to the impact of starting this new school, he was, of course, beginning to adjust to living in his father's home. This was not a new environment for him, because he had been visiting them easily every other week for the 2 years since the marriage. But now it had a different valence, because now it was his home, or everybody was talking about it as his home. And he was feeling that, that he could never call this place home. First of all, Susan, John's second wife, who he really liked prior to the move and who was really very helpful to him, and a much more organized and kind of regular person compared to his funkier and somewhat disorganized and creative mother, all of a sudden became really boring, alien, unlike anybody he ever wanted to be around, and he was in a very, very negative state and didn't know how he was going to live there for the next 4 years. He would call Anne to talk, to kind of let off steam and talk about how bad things were, but as she had predicted, she started another part of her job had been, another part of her career had been elaborated, and she was traveling a lot and was very busy, which was another contributor to this move, although not the critical one. And so she frequently wasn't there. And that was very disappointing to him, because they had been used to talking to each other much more frequently. And he was used to really having her support and her contribution. So it would have, this is, again, me reflecting on the case as opposed to the information that came out of the case, it would have meant really losing face to acknowledge his underlying feelings. But the fact of the matter was that his feelings were hurt. He felt very sad. He felt he had lost something, which he had, the contact with his mother, which probably would have been experienced anyway, even if he had stayed home because of his developmental level. But now that he was now that there was a physical rift and he was in another place, it was even more acute. But he couldn't admit to any of this, to loss, to sadness, because of his age. And it would have really been a blow to his self-esteem. So in a way, that benefited our relationship, because he really turned to me. Couldn't talk to his father about how angry he was about being in his home. He couldn't talk to his mother, didn't know kids in the environment yet, so he really didn't have any place to go except to therapy. And that was good for me and for us in our relationship. And of course, at the outset, our sessions focused on how angry he was, how disappointed in the circumstances. And during this phase, although there were many things he was doing to be provocative and make things worse for himself, I never would have made a suggestion of his doing anything differently, because he was clearly very bright, possibly gifted, I wasn't sure yet, and telling him what to do or offering suggestions, which he was already rejecting from Susan and John, would have really meant the kiss of death for our relationship. So I stayed pretty far away from recommendations. So as he began to relax with me and felt more comfortable, he occasionally would accept the possibility of maybe doing things differently. Most of the time, I tried to elicit from him other ways, talk about reframing, which I mentioned this morning, tried to reframe some situations so he could look at it from a different angle. And he would could potentially raise his self-esteem by coming up with another solution. He spent the first part, so bit by bit, he kind of settled into therapy, fighting and arguing about the home situation, but it was beginning to all normalize a little bit. Spent Christmas vacation with Ann, where once again he felt very disappointed. She had specifically taken a week off to spend time with him and for them to do things together. But when he returned, he said it wasn't really fun like it used to be. She was always preoccupied with work and had some pressures on her mind. And he was feeling rather sad and was able to talk about it. Throughout this part of our work together, I consistently saw the parents in different configurations. I would see Ann when she was in town, John and Susan together, sometimes John alone, because I knew that there was only a portion of what his experience was that Eric was able to talk about. A lot of it, I mean, he was, after all, just an adolescent, and he didn't have the perspective on his own behavior and on what was happening around him to really be able to give me a fuller picture. So I, as a therapist, really needed the parents to fill me in, to tell me where the problems were, and what his relationships with teachers and classmates and with them was really like. Both John and Susan used this as a time to ventilate some of their frustration, because as frustrated as he was with them, that's only half of as frustrated as they were with him, because he was really difficult to live with. Everything Susan did was wrong. Anything they offered in attempting to be helpful was rejected, and it was really not a whole lot of fun. But we have to look at what the meaning of Eric's anger, because although he was making Susan's life really difficult, we have to ask why that was. You know, prior to the move, he had really liked her. What was it that suddenly made for the difference? And what did make for the difference was the conversion of his feelings into a defense mechanism. In this case, the defense mechanism was displacement. The anger that he was really feeling toward John and Susan, his biological parents, was not acceptable. He couldn't really acknowledge that because he was in such a tenuous situation. So Susan became the scapegoat, and it made it very, very tough for everybody at this particular point. And so I was quite active, probably as active with the parents as I was with Eric, in trying to manage the situation. And I don't know if any of you either do or have received parent guidance, but I think parent guidance is a little bit of a misnomer. I think of it more as a juggling act where you're trying to keep everything even by you move in with the stepmother or the mother or the father or the couple, and then you move in with the child, because the idea is to kind of calm it down for everybody so they can at least talk to each other. And unless it's a real emergency, I don't get everybody into the room at the same time. I may get the couple, the parenting couple, into the room together, but I don't get them in with the child, because all of the issues that are creating the conflict only explode in the presence of a therapist. And the dynamic that gets set off is that everybody wants me to take their side. And so I wind up feeling like a parent with two fighting kids. So I don't do very much of that. So that was essentially the first stage of our work together. And this is the context. And up until now, there's no reason for us to think of psychological testing, learning disabilities, or any of that, but that was soon to change. Despite all of these improvements, Eric's grades had plummeted when he first made the move, and they had begun to pick up a little bit after the impact of the move and after he knew a few kids and got invited to a few parties. And he was feeling better about the move, certainly better about the school, if not the home situation. And better about his friends. But he'd been in his school now for 6 months or so, and his grades in math and in science were great. He had kind of moved up the ladder, and he was again really getting top scores. But his grades in English and history were floundering. They weren't going above maybe a B-. And this is a really bright kid. And this is a kid who had been used to getting A's in all of his written reports. And nobody really understood what was going on, and we were all rather worried about it. And on the basis of the lack of improvement, I suggested toward the end of the second semester that we might want to consider a learning educational workup. Because we didn't know whether Eric's work whether the work in the new school really was too difficult for him, if he was still functioning under the trauma of the move, whether the level of the work had stimulated or uncovered a previously existing learning disability. Pardon me. And since this was the beginning of high school, we certainly didn't want any of these problems to get compounded. So I referred John to a local psychologist who had a very good reputation, and she did a battery of tests. You're probably all familiar with it. It takes about 4 weeks, and then it takes another 4 weeks to grade them. And the conclusions were that Eric was a very bright boy with an IQ over 130, but with a variety of learning problems that put him into the twice exceptional category. The parents were confused about how a boy who was clearly so gifted could also be considered learning disabled, but I pointed out that these were not mutually exclusive categories, that we then discussed that there were many inconsistent findings, which I'm going to read to you, that Eric's vocabulary was very advanced, but he struggled in the area of verbal fluency. The, quote, test of ambiguous sentences, which correlates with creative writing and the ability to structure language, was in the very superior range. The conclusion was that Eric seemed to suffer with a language-based learning disability with concomitant processing speed deficits. Expressive language was considered challenging for Eric, whose greatest strength was in the area of problem solving, where he scored in the 99th percentile. The psychologist remembered tutoring twice a week and put the family in touch with a young learning specialist. It appeared that although he loved his subjects, his language-based learning deficit interfered with better performance. In addition, perhaps his slower processing speed was responsible for his difficulties in putting his thoughts down on paper. The recommendation was a twice-a-week tutoring session with this learning specialist, with whom she thought Eric would make a good, quick connection, which he did. She was kind of young and funky and a little irreverent, kind of like he was, and they were able to connect with one another. And she started her work with him in the area of organizational skills, prioritizing, and although he was initially cautious, he liked her, and he liked her approach, and they began to work together, and his grades improved somewhat, but only a little bit. And we were all surprised that he hadn't made more progress, because these were the standard techniques for dealing with the problems he was having, and yet his grades were certainly not coming anywhere near his math and science grades. Eric had brought his complaints about the workload and his grades into therapy, but he hadn't brought the learning problems in. He hadn't told me some of what was going on at home. And he certainly wasn't telling me what would happen when he sat down to do his written assignments. Now you have to realize that this was a pretty high-level, sophisticated school, and the assignments were really college level from my perspective. They were intricate, they were very abstract, and he did all the research very, very well, and he really liked the stimulation of doing the research. But what would happen was when he would sit down to do the writing and thinking of handing these articles in, he couldn't budge, he was paralyzed. And he would plug himself into his iPod, he would go into the kitchen for milk and cookies, he would then start arguing with Susan and John about various things, or ask them their advice, or call Ann, but it wasn't working. Nothing was really getting him unstuck from this position. And Ann and John began to fight over how to handle this. And that's another thing that you probably, those of you who have adolescents, are aware of, is that an adolescent can really throw a family into disarray and disorganization. They started to fight with one another about how to handle him, and who was being too permissive and who was being too rigid, and why he was having this difficulty. However, no matter what happened between them, it was still clear that we didn't know really what the issues were with Eric. And I have to admit that I too was feeling rather helpless in the situation, because I was, although as a psychotherapist, I always have my Sherlock Holmes hat on and trying to find what the thread is here, how to unravel the mystery of the symptom. I wasn't getting any information. I wasn't able, in exploring with parents or with Eric, whether this had ever happened before, whether there are any early indications of this kind of a problem. Nobody had any information, which made it very frustrating. And so finally, I had Eric bring in some of his writing. I figured, let me find out what's really going on here. He said he got good grades, even though he was handing these essays in a day or two after they were due, and even though he's being docked for handing them in late, they still were good. And I was truly astonished at the level of sophistication, of synthesis, of difficult material, really quite impressive. I mean, these essays were really at a very, very high level. And when I told him this, he said, well, he used to write really easily. He didn't know what had taken place. That he described how writing used to actually be a lot of fun. And he told me about this earlier stage when he was learning how his letters, and he was learning how to read, and how he was working with Ann, and what fun it would be, and how he would dictate stories to Ann, who that later read them to John, and how appreciative John was. And eventually he would be writing these things on his own. But he always enjoyed reading them out loud to her, and felt very proud of his writing. And in elementary and middle school, his writing was, he considered it on a par with his math and science. So this was a real departure from previous experiences. And he too, he was very upset about it, because, needless to say, he felt quite out of control. I mean, you've probably all experienced sitting at a computer and wanting to compose something and just not knowing where to go and not being able to put anything down. Now I'm highlighting these earlier experiences in writing because they represent the context in which he developed his writing skills, and actually some of the emotional component of these skills. They were complex, they were relational, and they were tied to his relationship with his mother. Well, by the summer, between his sophomore and junior years, things had not really improved a whole lot. Not in, I mean, he and I were doing well, he and his friends were doing well, even his relationship with Ann and John was doing better. But his writing skills and the panics that he would find himself in whenever he had a written assignment, which was frequent, had made no progress at all. So we all put the adults put their heads together, and we thought, you know, if he could have an unpressured situation in which he was asked to write, but not graded, and where it wasn't so important, or where he didn't have to spend so much of his time on research, maybe that would either teach us something or help him overcome this paralysis that he was living with. So as it turned out, Susan found the perfect solution. There was one of the high schools was giving a course in writing. It was going to be over the summer for just, 4 or 5 weeks. And the format of the course was that the students would read essays, short essays, a couple of pages. And the assignment was for them to analyze what they thought the author had intended and hand it in, a page, page and a half, no more than a page and a half of written work. It seemed so reasonable and so doable for him. And he was actually interested in taking it. So he started the course, and he liked it. And even there, he was a little late with his assignments. But the crunch point came for the final assignment, because the teacher was going on an international trip right after the class was over, and made it clear several weeks in advance that this last paper had to be submitted on time, because she just wasn't going to be able to be there to grade it. And if she didn't grade it, they weren't going to get credit for it. So Eric was a little bit worried about this, knowing his own predisposition for starting things late and getting them in late. So much so that he actually prepared in advance and brought it into his therapy session to tell me what he thought and how he was going to lay it out. It sounded really fine. Then he went to class. And after class, he came into his session. I was expecting a really glowing report. And this is really a very pivotal situation. So he came in, sort of hangdog, and he said, "You won't believe it. I couldn't write it." I said, "What do you mean? You had it mostly written. It was you told me everything that you wanted to say. How could you not have written this?" He said, "I don't know. But I sat there at night, in front of the computer, ready to type it out, and nothing came. And then I did my usual. I went to the refrigerator, I listened to music, I walked around. Said I couldn't even get the first sentence out. I didn't know where I wanted to begin." So he figured he had absolutely no choice, that despite the teacher's adamant message to the class that she would accept no brooking of her demands that be done at the last session, he had to talk to her. So he did. He went to her at the beginning, after class, and told her, he said, "Look, I know what you said. I don't have it." He said, "But I can really try to get it to you. I had it worked out in my head. I just couldn't write it." So she pulled him aside. She said, "Look, you are not to tell a soul about this. This is our secret. But I am going to give you a very, very special gift. I am going to let you email it to me. If it gets to my computer no later than tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, I will accept it. Otherwise, it's over." So he reported feeling enormously relieved. And he had a little time between this class and our session. And he was kind of wandering around school and past the computer room, wandered in, and he sat down and wrote the paper. I mean, he said, when he told me about it afterwards, he said it was like he was in a daze. He doesn't remember thinking. He doesn't remember what he wrote. He just knew he sat down, wrote this paper, and emailed it to her, really within minutes after the class. I was flabbergasted. I was flabbergasted in two ways. First, that he'd been unable to do it, and then equally as flabbergasted at the switch, the turn of events. And I said, Eric, like, what is this about? What was so different from last night when you were trying to write it to when you spoke to the teacher? Something in there unlocked your brain, but we don't know what that something was. And we started to talk about it, and he said, well, I said, I know she liked you, and, you talked about liking her, but, I mean, what in that made for such a huge, huge difference? And he said, well, I guess I really felt she cared about me, and she liked me, and she was making me feel very special. And I said, well, is that something that you don't usually feel? And much to my amazement, and for the first time in all of the months that we've been working together, his eyes filled up with tears, and he said, I haven't really felt special in a really, really long time. I used to feel that way with Mom, and I've been missing it. We used to write, and we used to talk about things, and we had this kind of special relationship. Not that Dad isn't special, but it's different. And my relationship with her was always kind of cozy. And I sort of felt that with this teacher. And I guess it really made a big difference to me. And then he said, it's really been a very long time since I've had this with Mom. And we together tried to trace where it had started, whether it was when his mother went back to work, when he started to have a longer school day, or whether it was when his parents separated or finally divorced. We couldn't quite nail it down, but he said it had been a really long time since he'd felt this kind of tightness with his mother, this intimacy that he was missing. And he said he'd been longing for his old Mom for really quite a long time. Well, this was really super important because I had been, like a hound dog waiting for something that I could sink my teeth into psychologically that would account for some of this symptom, because certainly he had been getting the remedial help he needed for it, and he was getting the stimulation in school. There was nothing that I could account for why this persisted. So he and I were actually pretty lit up about this as possibly being the answer that we had been looking for. And in fact, for a number of months after this event, which I do think was quite pivotal emotionally for him, his grades really improved and he handed things in on time. And then it began to slide. It sort of was like, the bell curve went up and then it went down. And he was needing extra time again. So we revisited what it meant. And what we got to was that the extra time, that by not handing it in on time, by having an engagement with his various teachers, and by somehow being permitted or squeezing out this extra time from them, he felt once again as if he was special, as if they must like him particularly, that they were willing to give him special dispensation. And obviously he still needed that. And so in talking about it and connecting it with how he had felt with his mother and maybe how he still felt with his mother, this once again began to resolve, and his grades improved. I realized in our talking about it that actually the same thing had existed in therapy, because I don't know if I mentioned, I may have forgotten to put this in, but, you know, even at the beginning, when Eric had started to connect with me and talk with me, it was always the very end of the hour when he would say, oh, and this thing happened. You know, we would both be hanging on the door as my other appointment was sitting in the waiting room. And he would wind up telling me the most important part of the session, basically after the session was over. So I pointed out to him that this business with extra time as a test for how people really felt about him really was across the board and included me as well. That he sort of didn't pull it together until he was out of time. Well, unlocking the reasons for unconscious symptoms, whether they're learning disabilities or other kinds of symptoms, and as you know, I mean, there are any number of symptoms. Somebody spoke to us this morning about a child who had an ache in her foot that was not diagnosable by any of the doctors that they went to, or a cough that had no biological basis, and we know about stomach aches and headaches. And essentially, I think learning disabilities, at least in this boy, falls into the same category, and stripping the many layers of defenses and subterfuge and avoidance away from the symptoms so that you can get to the kind of the kernel, the underlying kernel, can take many, many months. And that's whether it's a child or an adult. So I felt that we really had been quite successful with Eric in at least understanding what this was about. So, and things improved in a dramatic way, but not totally. And that ushers in the third phase of my work with him, which I call the gifted learning disability, because now he didn't have just a regular learning disability. We sort of knew what that was about, and it was a symptom. But something still wasn't going as well as it could go. You know, he started to hand his papers in on time, got good grades, and as I said, once again, there were some situations where he just wasn't handing them in, or they weren't doing as well, and he felt he could knock off this work really easily and wasn't taking time with it the way he should. And he sort of felt, well, now that he was over his learning disability, you know, things should go really smoothly. And he now had incorporated the notion of being very smart or gifted, and he was getting really good feedback. His teachers were telling him his papers were very creative. So, I mean, he didn't really have to put a lot of work in, right? You know, we all know that if you're really smart, you can just do anything and, you know, like a flash. Except, of course, it doesn't work that way. And what was happening is that he was really cutting corners, and he was afraid of being as good as he could be. And he knew in math and science, it somehow wasn't as much of an issue as it was in writing. He told me about, and then, so as we explored this further, he told me about having had a very, really unsettling and creepy experience. Because as I mentioned, this was not a lightweight school, and the workload was very, very, it was sophisticated, and there was a lot of it. And he had an art exam, he had an art project coming up. He had to write essays on some art assignment, and he really didn't have much time with which to do it, and it really wasn't his primary objective. So he did one of his corner cuttings. He kind of took the book and practically flipped through it, you know, saw the topic sentences, never really read it, and wrote reports summarizing what this was about, satisfying whatever the assignment was. And he told me, somewhat paranoid, said it was complete bull. And when he got the paper back, or the papers, he had A's. And that really freaked him out, because he said, I didn't read this. I didn't know the material. How could I possibly write a paper that was so good that it got A's? Friends in my class really put some time into it, and they didn't do as well. And this is part of what we are calling the gifted learning disability syndrome. It has to do with feeling that there are qualities, intuitive or cognitive assets that you possess that may be out of your control. Because I think the element that really freaked him out about this was that he did not exert any conscious control over what he knew and what he was going to write. He dashed it off. It was as if it went from his hand directly to the paper, bypassing his brain. And I think it can be very terrifying, especially to adolescents, who, as we've said, in other parts of their lives, and gifted adolescents in particular, need to really exert control over their world. And this was an example of, he didn't have full control over this. It almost happened, it did happen intuitively without his being in control. And he didn't know where it was going to go. And maybe there were more events like this. And what were the other kids going to think if he could generate these kinds of essays without putting any work in? They were going to hate him. And it had so many ramifications, negative ramifications for him, that it was, in his mind, easier to have a deficit and not to use his intuition and his cognition and do the kind of job that he was clearly capable of doing than to put out the really good piece of work. And this piece of it took a number of months of us working on, because I think it cut to the core of some of the anxieties that gifted kids have. And he tried a lot of techniques for avoiding doing the kind of work that he's capable of, which included not reading anything. And of course, he didn't get a good grade. He didn't have ESP. He had to do something. He had to at least look at the material, however briefly. But this was a real sticking point for him. And I think it's something that although he mastered it by the graduation, I think it's an issue that will continue to be something he has to work on. So, basically, I consider this a pretty successful therapy. I learned a huge amount, and hopefully, from the looks of things, he learned a huge amount as well, he learned about psychodynamics and relationships and how they can affect him, and also he learned that he was really quite an exceptional child. And I learned about really the many, many ways in which a gifted person can avoid knowing that they're gifted and bypass doing a really wonderful job. When he graduated, he got accepted to a really fine Ivy League school. We continued to have sessions over the phone, and gradually they were on an as-needed basis, and at this point I haven't spoken to him for a number of years, although he would periodically call me in a crisis and to review things and, unravel something that was kind of a knotty issue for him, not having to do with learning, but other parts of his life. So, but our conclusion is that being gifted and is not always it's not always a gift. And most of you know that already anyway.
So we hope that we were able to present you with a sort of a different structured way of looking at this. Reviewing back where we were, I hope that you'll at least begin to see that you do not have to accept the fact that all learning disabilities mean there is some sort of neurologic problem there that has to be dealt with, that can only be compensated with. And especially for gifted kids, if you're going to do an assessment, you really need to assess the gifted part. That does not mean just looking for a special curriculum for a kid. It really means trying to understand the kid's response to his or her giftedness itself, especially these phenomena like, Mom, I know things that other kids don't know, but I don't know how I know them. It's a creepy experience for a kid to be able to figure out a complex theoretical math problem and not know how it happened. They distrust it. They don't think of it as an asset, which is a pity. If you were to take a look at many of the Nobel Prize scientists who were gifted children, probably, not all necessarily, who end up with these major discoveries, you find that this is exactly the technique that they use. It's not necessarily a logical conclusion from an examination of a tremendous amount of data. It's usually some sense of things. There's a fascinating book called The Extracognitive Sources of Knowledge, one of my favorite references. And in that book, there's several chapters. One of the chapters is an interview with Nobel Prize scientists who talk about, well, how did they make these wonderful discoveries? And they talk about starting off with a sense of things. If you are familiar with how Einstein started off with his discovery of the theory of relativity, he had a suspicion that it worked this way. He didn't start off after tremendous amounts of analysis of data. And that can be something that you can say to a kid too, by the way. Great discoveries are made that way. Then it's after the discovery and the sense of it that you then start to prove it. I'll give you another dramatic example from my own practice. I had a student a couple of years ago who was beginning, we were about 3 months into it, and her patients were responding extremely well. I mean, it was really unusual for her to make this kind of contact with her patients. Things were going exceptionally well. And I commented to her, I said, you're doing really a beautiful, beautiful job. And then I said, you have an unusual intuitive sense for this. You really, really have a feel for patients. Well, she's another student who broke down and started crying. I said, why are you crying? She said, this is just so upsetting to me. I said, you're upset by this? She said, I've done work in math, I've done work in physics. She had a whole history that I knew nothing about. She had done all sorts of other work, and she said, everybody, no matter what I study, has said that. I said, well, why are you bothered by it? She said, because I don't know what it is. I don't know how to use it really yet. And I said, well, it's true, you're learning how to use it, but why are you thinking of it as a bad thing? She said, it's just, that's the way it is. Okay, so hopefully we've raised your consciousness about this, and you've got another way to think about this. There is another alternative. You do not, being learning disabled is not a sentence. It does not have to be a lifelong condition that makes you feel inadequate. That's not to say that all learning disabilities are like this. Some of them are, because those are the ones we see. How many of those are? Well, we don't really know, but I can say that there's a lot more likelihood that they are going to be like that in the gifted arena than not. And so to come back to that paper that I mentioned, the last paper written about the gifted learning disability syndrome, or twice exceptionality, I think we've got a little tiny key that's unlocked part of that lock and mystery for why the giftedness and learning disability is such a difficult thing to understand. And hopefully you've all enjoyed yourselves. And as I said this morning, I don't see anybody saying you're holding their head with a headache, but that's the way it was for us in the beginning when we tried to understand it all. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for your questions. And